The 1950s really set off the idea of consumer culture on steroids. So, yeah, in the decade of the 1920s, you had a consumer culture that was largely unfiltered, and it basically wound up putting us into a Great Recession. Otherwise, though, the decade of the 1950s, we had learned from some of the mistakes of the 1920s because we had government barriers in and around that time. But because people still had more money and they sought more opportunities for entertainment, mobility, they were moving to the suburbs, they're doing all kinds of different things, watching movies, they had TV sets. This consumer craze began to build even more. So the consumer culture really gained a strong foothold in the 1950s again. And America had this some sort of preoccupation, if you will, with being able to buy things. And it's one thing to go out and buy a car, and it's another thing to go out and pay for it in full all at once. The overwhelming majority of people today do not pay cash for a brand new car. Okay? Um, Even though many of your financial experts like Dave Ramsey or whoever would say never ever take out a loan for a car, pay cash and then invest the rest, that sort of philosophy, that's not realistic for most people. Even if you're buying a modest vehicle, it's still not feasible for most of us to go out there and plunk X amount of dollars on a modest vehicle. It just doesn't happen. Okay? The idea of consumer credit is not new, but it's reined in the 1950s. The idea that, yeah, you need a new refrigerator, you can go buy one, and instead of paying for it all up front, you can pay it in installments. Pay for it over the course of a year or two at various different interest rates. Um, Cars really become a big target for consumers. As I mentioned a few slides ago, my dad, loves a 57 Chevy. You have other things around that time that really started to gain advent, but cars were really big. You think about America's car culture today. America, since really the days of the assembly line, has been fascinated with cars. But it was really in the 1950s as they became really more widespread available for most Americans that cars really just kind of took off. Cars became the American symbol for prosperity. You had a car. You had a new car. You had more than one car. Wow. In the 1950s, that sort of craze drove car culture in America. There are a couple other things we're going to talk about later on that would further drive it. But otherwise, because people aren't having to plunk down all kinds of money for it, they're now able to actually buy and just pay it off in various different installments. Okay, so you might go to a car dealership today and you might take out a loan to buy your car or truck, and maybe it's 48 months. I've seen recent advertisements that talk about 84-month installments, 7 years to pay off a vehicle. 7 years. I don't know about that. 4 years, 5 years, maybe. 7 years? I don't know. I don't know if that's a really wise idea to take out a 7-year loan on a depreciating asset that you're going to use heavily. That vehicle is going to look drastically different 7 years from now than it will today. But otherwise, though, things like that make things possible. So the consumer culture, the car culture really comes into play. And it's further boomed by the idea of not having to live in the city. A little bit ago, I talked about how suburbs had changed the American culture. Um, you have various different developers who espouse the idea of developing neighborhoods in and around suburbs that change the way that people live. So William Levitt was a real estate developer back northeast who developed the idea of planned neighborhoods in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, that sort of region, where you might have homes that have a similar architectural style, like Craftsman home or Cape Cod style or ranch style, something else of the sort, that are basically tract homes that have identical interiors, identical layouts. They could be sold for a specified amount of money that are reasonably affordable for everyday middle class folks, especially veterans with a GI Bill, where they can take out a guaranteed loan for their home. They're going to have a backyard. They're going to have a garage, a driveway. Um, the idea of building tract style homes really come out of William Levitt's idea of Levitt towns that can be built on the outskirts of towns or outskirts of big cities. So you have an idea of a growth in suburbs. By 1960, a third of all Americans lived in suburbs. So what that meant was you have people that are escaping the urban center, the crowdedness of the urban center. They're leaving, they're migrating to go to the suburbs. They're leaving the crime, the pollution, the congestion, the high costs. The suburbs are able to invest in better schools. You can escape racial tension. You have more space available. You have all kinds of different things. And the suburbs meant that families could focus on families as opposed to being worried so much about crime or other things that are involved in an urban setting. You can focus on the family element. And you have larger homes that may be less expensive. You can have more kids because you can have more space for them, more rooms available, more land for them to play in, less noise, less congestion, and more space. That's what the suburbs meant for a huge amount of people. And so the idea of living in a community where you have similar, like minded people, similar in age, similar family values, similar family situations, makes it easier for families to have connected social circles with like minded people. Um, you might have moms at home or otherwise, but generally speaking, you can have a working professional dad who might work in the city and he commutes, but he lives back in the suburb. Think about the Dallas area. Think about all the surrounding towns. And of course, many of you know I have a nickname for every suburb and every town in the Metroplex. We won't go into that in this video. But generally speaking, think about all the Dallas different suburbs: Richardson, Plano, Allen, Frisco, Irving, Coppell, Grapevine, Garland, Mesquite, Duncanville, Red Oak, DeSoto. You have all kinds of towns around the city of Dallas. 50 years ago, those towns were very small and small communities. Richardson wasn't very big. Allen was a small itty bitty little blip on the map. Now it's got 110,000 people. Plano was just a small little bitty farming community. Now it's got almost 300,000 people. So neighborhoods were developed as a result of suburban growth. So you can plan your suburbs into having more affluent neighborhoods that can attract people with more money who want more land and a bigger house. Invariably, it's also going to create what's called a white flight. So a lot of your folks who want to escape racial tension, or if they don't want to be around black people or whatnot, you're going to have white people with money who are going to move out of the city and into the suburbs, and they're going to take their tax revenue with them. That's going to create a strain on cities like Dallas or Fort Worth or other cities that rely upon tax revenues, and it's going to be a big boom for a lot of your suburbs like Plano that will invariably grow because of the money that's now being influxed into their systems. So you have a white flight and you have an influx of your African American, other Hispanic, or maybe even other ethnicities that move into cities now. Typically, your urban environments are going to have more and higher percentages of minorities. And it's largely because of the era of the 1950s and white flight, white people wanting to get away from ethnics, if you will. Okay. Otherwise, you might have towns divided. Maybe you're really affluent part of town, maybe you're middle class part of town, and maybe you're less, to do elsewhere. A lot of the suburbs north of Dallas don't really have a whole lot of crime or poor parts, if you will. The poorest parts of Allen, Texas, aren't that bad in comparison. Okay, um, you look at a town like Allen or Frisco, and the crime rate's low, education's good, medium income is solid. All those things make a very big difference. So you now see the idea of planned communities where you have de facto segregation, and you also have people that are reinforcing various different societal norms too. Your beaver cleaver type situation where your dad works, but your mom is home baking all day in the kitchen while the kids are at school. The ideal conic image of the 1950s with the woman at home, the dad working, and the kids at school, that's largely emphasized as the societal norm around this time. And it's an iconic image. Today, we believe in more flexibility for women. Okay? Back then, women should be home. That was the mindset back then. And it was largely born out of the suburban ideal that grew from the 1950s.